Despite being well renowned for their extremely popular multiplayer and esports scenes, the RTS genre is home to some of the most fun and enjoyable single-player campaigns found across all of gaming. But if I had to crown one campaign in particular as the most fun and replayable, I'd have to give that title to Starcraft 2 Wings of Liberty. Keep in mind that SC2 was released during the golden age of Blizzard Entertainment, where unlike today, they were one of the most beloved and cherished video game developers in the world, and every game they released was widely regarded as the pinnacle of their respective genres. And especially after the critical acclaim the Warcraft and Starcraft games and their respective expansions received, in no small part due to their engaging single-player experiences, you could really tell that they were comfortable with designing fun and interesting campaigns with loads of unique ideas and concepts that I still haven't seen many RTS campaigns attempt to this day, nearly a decade and a half later. However, if I had to choose one mission I love the most, particularly because I believe it perfectly matches its gameplay to its narrative, which I will concede is the one department where StarCraft 2 really falters, it's In Utter Darkness. Apparently 2010 was the year of AAA sci-fi games running with last stands against an overwhelming alien force, and In Utter Darkness was no different with two basic mission objectives. Kill a fuck ton of alien scum, and die. The Protoss are too proud of a race to simply die out without having a badass last stand, but even when the most valiant Protoss heroes answer the call for this final battle, you can just feel this overwhelming sense of dread and desperation. It really sets the mood when shortly after the introductory cutscene ends, where Zeratul all but confirms that their race's extinction is imminent, you hear one of the most accomplished admirals proclaim that he has gathered the last of his great fleet, and it's just 7 basic starships. It's just an extremely dark, yet bizarrely triumphant mission that I really love. But the question always remained. With a proper strategy and proper execution, could you theoretically beat this mission and live forever? No. No, you can't. It's just not fucking happening, brother. Yeah, ever since the game was released back in 2010, the answer to that question has remained the same. Some people took it upon themselves to slaughter as much Zerg as possible before their inevitable demise, and don't get me wrong, there were extremely valiant efforts, but it was always a losing battle. Until I did the impossible. Saw the invisible. Row, row, fight the power. First things first, as soon as the introductory cutscene ends and the mission begins, we have 4 main objectives. Immediately rush unit upgrades to make the mid-game as smooth as possible, begin construction of our 3rd base for extra resources, build walls near the 3 main entrances to enable more efficient trades, and build up an extremely cost-effective army that is capable of handling the early game, yet valuable enough to be useful during the mid to late game. First and foremost, for upgrades we are immediately rushing air attack, and ground shields. We'll also begin researching air armor shortly, but ground armor isn't actually necessary for reasons that will only become clear much later during the endgame. Honestly though, even before then, if you're doing everything right, your ground forces should never sustain much, if any, damage past their shields. So it may be worth upgrading if you're uncertain of your micro, but generally I think it's safe to skip. Our second objective is going to be fairly difficult though. The defense for our 3rd base is going to be effectively the exact same as our outer perimeter, but while you can set up an extremely efficient defensive formation here where your army can quickly mobilize to whatever side is getting hit, our golden base is on the other side of the fucking continent and is much more vulnerable to enemy attacks. But fortunately, since the attack waves are completely predetermined, especially since we're trying to play as conservatively as possible, Knowing the attack windows, what the waves generally contain, and how they're sent out becomes invaluable information. For example, the second attack wave of the mission will always attack our golden base just after the 4-minute mark, which is fairly early, but is still a considerable amount of time to prepare for its defense. And after that initial attack wave, it'll be about another 3.5 minutes before that base falls under threat again, which in total gives us nearly 7.5 minutes to have these 3 locations under lockdown, which is substantially harder than it sounds since you have to play so economically, but even despite that, it still remains to be a feasible goal. And directly on that note, let's go ahead and talk about walls. For this, we're going to be using cybernetics cores, and if you don't play the campaign or other various PvE modes, this may seem extremely bizarre, as there's really no reason to have more than 2 of them at any given moment. And of course, this is a structure with absolutely no offensive or even necessarily defensive properties, so what is it doing here? Well, it has 2 things going for it that make it immensely useful here. Cybercores alongside forges have the highest mineral to health ratio of any Protoss structure, of course excluding structures that require Vespene gas and assimilators for some reason. But the main reason why cybernetics cores are so useful beyond their high durability is because it's really easy to taunt the enemy AI into attacking the units on the other side of the wall, which makes them clump up into exploitable positions where only a few of our units will be attacked at any given moment, and splash damage becomes much more lethal for us. And this is especially effective when combined with a Dark Templar. Yet again, knowing the timing of the attack waves is extremely helpful, as the Zerg only begin to send detectors around the 12-minute mark. And even then, they only send 1 Overseer per wave, so they're pretty easy to snipe, which allows our Dark Templar to wreak havoc without fear of reprisal. And especially in tandem with our Cybercore walls, this really confuses the AI by effectively convincing them, hey, there's some extremely high priority units you should try to kill on the other side of those worthless buildings. All you have to do to get to them is cross through that rather conveniently placed gap in their defenses, but, surprise, that gap is actually a murder man. Have fun getting through him. And of course, alongside those high priority units, there's going to be a ton of stacked defense by them to help aggro even more enemies, all the while dishing out reliable damage without any associated Vespene or supply cost. Also, on the topic of DTs and walls, I will add here that it is also completely viable to have a wall that's nothing but Dark Templar, and while I will personally vouch for the Cybercore method, I also can't really argue against a wall of invisible men. Both strategies have genuine trade-offs to consider, with a fairly concise summary being that the DTs have a substantially easier early game, at the expense of an immensely punishing late game, as if a single Overseer gets in range of your defensive line, it's essentially GG. Meanwhile, Cybercores trade in that free early game with a much more forgiving and linear difficulty curve as the mission progresses. So which one you would prefer is totally subjective, as you can reach the same end state with both strategies. But moving on to unit composition, without the mass DT spam, the role of most effective anti-ground unit is primarily defined by the Colossus. Yeah, I don't think it's a surprise that the massive siege unit is going to be especially effective with all the previously mentioned AI shenanigans. Thanks to their damage profile and extremely high range, it's entirely possible for them to rack up a KDR in the hundreds, all the while remaining completely untouched. However, you may be noticing that we haven't built a single anti-air unit yet. And although there are a few decently scary airwaves early on, as long as you keep them alive, the last of that great fleet I mentioned earlier is perfectly capable of handling them on their own. And especially alongside some decently placed storms and some additional cannons, the enemy air units really shouldn't be a problem until roughly the mid-game. Which, conveniently enough, just after the 10-minute mark, more reinforcements arrived to join our valiant last stand, alongside the ability to warp in our key unit, the Void Ray. Yeah, we're embracing our inner Bronze League heroes. The reason why we want to mass Void Rays in particular will be much clearer later on, but by this time we should have most of our upgrades nearing completion, and our newly unlocked unit will synergize extremely well with our established defenses. The Void Rays can easily snipe any incoming Overseers that reveal our stoic Dark Templar, and really they're just effective at killing off all of the incoming air units from this point forward. But of course, they also have an extremely potent single target damage profile, which will be immensely valuable to bring down the bulkier ground targets that the Colossi will struggle with. And in tandem with the DTs and the wall, the Colossi will vaporize to squish your units so that the Void Rays can focus fire priority targets down with minimal downtime for their intensifying attacks. So overall, it's an extremely effective defense composition, and one that'll only continue to become even more potent as the mission continues. But another important thing to note at this time is that the second base should be nearly depleted of minerals, and as completely arbitrary and bizarre as this is going to sound, you do not want to let the probes mine out these mineral fields. I don't really know how many times I have to say this'll only make sense later in the script, but if you want to have the smoothest endgame possible, it'll really help you out. So once we're almost out of minerals at that base, we're going to follow that up with a probe massacre. Although if you want to keep them around a little bit longer, it is totally worth it, as their target priority is so low that on hold position, they can actually become an effective wall for your wall. But you will eventually have to send them all to their deaths, as a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but probes aren't going to be a fundamental unit for our main army composition, so don't get too attached to them. You know what you can be attached to, though? This video's sponsor, Mohandar. Yeah, keeping him alive isn't difficult to do. At all. Unless you send him out into an enemy attack wave with literally no support, he really shouldn't ever be at risk of dying. But he's one of the most important units for this challenge, so make sure he doesn't attempt to pull a Tassadar and steer into a collision course with a fucking ground. Anyways, assuming your early game went well enough, your defense should be holding excellently until another wave of reinforcements arrive, this time with a fuck ton of carriers. This is probably where most of you are expecting me to say something akin to, oh, now that we have access to the carrier, we're going to stop all Void Ray production and transition into a mighty carrier fleet that would rival the Golden Armada, which is where you're actually mistaken. Yeah, the absolute best unit for this mission isn't just terrible for us, but they're actively detrimental. To get the obvious point out of the way, carriers have to have interceptors to deal damage. Interceptors cost minerals to build. Minerals are extremely finite. And since interceptors are very disposable, this introduces an upkeep mechanic that isn't an issue at all in a standard playthrough where one of your main objectives is to die. That's a complete deal breaker for this specific run. But also, to tap the sign again here, since you can't manually control the interceptors once they're sent out, during the endgame their sporadic nature will regularly cause us to lose the mission. Almost instantaneously, with no real way to properly circumvent it. So, yeah, we don't want to produce any additional carriers for our army. But do know that I am specifically saying that we do not want to produce any additional carriers, and not that we don't want any carriers, period, and that's because all the reinforcements we receive throughout the mission are completely free, including their supply costs, which means that the carriers are worth keeping around as tanky, over-engineered bricks that draw aggro away from our precious Void Ray fleet. But of course, in order to keep them around without instantaneous death, we need a reliable way to get rid of all their interceptors. Fortunately, there is a rather convenient method to do just that. Just outside of our base on the northern side of the map are 3 spore crawlers and 2 spine crawlers that will infinitely respawn if you kill them. So attacking them while keeping our carrier far enough away from the spore crawlers allows us to safely kill off all of our interceptors while maintaining our target dummies for future use. Anyways, sometime after the carrier spawn, we should be close to hitting max supply, in which we'll start killing off our remaining starting units, our colossi, and even some of our probes to get even more void rays. Of course our reinforcements are exempt from this purge, but I did want to add here that keeping all of them alive isn't strictly necessary, but it is beneficial to keep their survival in mind, as in total, your air fleet can be joined by an additional 8 phoenixes, 6 void rays, and 6 carriers, which in total is 70 supply worth of free stuff, not even counting the immensely powerful hero units, which, I mean, I'm sure you could quantify their supply value by simply comparing their stats to the base units and going from there, but Mohandar is just simply not worth 3 to 4 void rays. My dude is worth like 10 at the very least. Also, keeping your ground reinforcements alive isn't as valuable, but they are decently helpful to keep around, as they can help hold the line during an extremely critical moment. And speaking of which, let's talk about that critical moment. The transition from the late game to the end game. Now, I'm going to highlight some footage from a standard playthrough here to talk about the problem. Simply put, after you pass the required amount of kills to beat the mission, the attack waves sent out become fucking ruthless. The airwaves in particular become especially harrowing. The devs knew that if you made it this far, it's fairly likely that you had your very own Golden Armada on standby, so they ramped up the sheer amount of enemy flyers sent out to a monstrous degree. And with a maxed out air army, it's totally possible to fly to a pocket of the map where ground units can't attack you and try to hold off there. But you're just not going to survive long doing that. I'd say on average past the 3rd wave, you're going to sustain at least 1 to 3 losses per attack. And then Lanchester's laws start to kick in and you'll start losing 5 units per attack. Then 8 units, then all but a select few of your units, then suddenly there's going to be one final push where you finally witness your extinction. It's a fucking nightmare. Which is why we're going to bully the AI into repeatedly falling into a death trap. Because the main issue that arises with circumventing our fate is that there's nowhere on the map to rally your ground forces where they're safe from the enemy ground attacks. Not only is the warp prism entirely disabled, but you also can't warp onto any of these high ground positions, which effectively locks you into an unwinnable scenario as your air fleet needs ground support in order to survive against the enemy flyers. And that very same ground support is extremely susceptible to being overrun and dying unceremoniously. So, what do we do? Why are we here? Well, I knew if I could find a way to get even just a few ground units out of this predicament, my odds of success would rise exponentially. So I got to work, and after a few hours of testing, I was finally able to resolve this conundrum by discovering what I'm going to dub the Archon Bidet. Well, it goes between that or Skibidi Archon, and I don't think any of us want the latter. Anyways, eventually you'll receive your final wave of reinforcements, which has our boy Artanis in it. Artanis is piloting the Shield of Ire, which is a super buffed mothership, and you know, there was a long period of time where the mothership was considered an utter meme unit. Potentially one of the worst units in the entire game. But during the early days of Starcraft 2, the mothership was a meta-defining badass that could win games almost instantly. Particularly because it had access to probably the most powerful spell this game has ever seen. And that would be Vortex. Vortex is a lingering AoE ability that draws in all nearby units into a black hole, or a dimensional warp field if you want to be really fancy. And after it dissipates, so do all the units inside. They're just gone. Bye-bye. Okay, obviously that version of Vortex never made it into the live game, but after a certain amount of time has passed, all the units caught inside of the Vortex will suddenly reappear. And what made this really fucky is that they instantly reappeared at the origin point of the Vortex, which enabled the infamous Archon Toilet. Because the Archon has extremely powerful AoE damage that's primarily balanced by its low range and minuscule splash radius. So when combined with Vortex, which just completely offsets both of those weaknesses, yeah, even the most tanky and formidable armies in the game would just be instantly vaporized. Yeah, this was such a nuclear strategy that Vortex had to receive a massive nerf before it was just removed from the game entirely. And you may think I'm bringing all this up because I plan on using it against Zerg, and you are right, it will be an invaluable tool for survival, but there's a reason I'm calling it the Archon Bidet and not just going with the Archon Toilet. Because here's the thing. Artanis has 500 energy compared to the base mothership's 200. So instead of being able to cast only 2 abilities at max energy, Chad Tanis over here can cast up to 5 in rapid succession. Which is extremely helpful because there's another ability that the mothership has access to. Mass Recall. Mass Recall sends all allied units within the reticule to the mothership after a short duration. And after about an hour of just recalling units into random locations, I figured out that you can actually recall a few ground units into this crevice right here. But it's not a lot of ground units, only about 5 to 6 at most, which is helpful, but isn't exactly going to turn the tide against a coming apocalypse. However, if you combine this with Vortex and our massively increased energy cap,
there can be no doubt. Our path is...
Fear is an illusion. I am but a phantom.
Faith before fear.
I bask in the twilight.
Dawn.
Jakul Inak. I am
Harak and Vayash. March boldly without fear.
Fear is an illusion.
Now we're on to something. I found that at max energy, you can get about 24 Templar into this crevice, which we can then morph into Archons. And since the airwaves clump up so tightly before being sent out, 12 Archons will regularly kill off entire waves of air units before they even land to hit on our ships. Which is fucking incredible. But of course it couldn't just be that easy, so there's still a few problems here. The most pressing of which is that they can still be attacked by Hydralisks and Hybrid Destroyers, which, you know, kind of defeats the entire point of why we're doing this, and I initially figured that this would just be the end of this video. I wouldn't exactly consider spending a few hours figuring out how to make our Archons even worse a positive development. But after even more testing, I figured out how to alleviate that weakness with extreme consistency. So in regards to how the attack waves operate, as far as I can tell, they kinda just attack move your base. But once your main base is cleared out, the AI will then check the map to attack whatever is still alive, which can result in... let's be kind and call it chicanery. Yeah, this isn't my first rodeo with the Starcraft AI, but there are some important distinctions to be made with this mission in particular. Firstly is that the win condition in Starcraft 2 is to destroy all of your enemy structures. So for the vast majority of the campaign, if you lose all of your buildings, no matter how many units you may have out on the map, it's just GG. Better luck next time. But here, it would be depressingly anticlimactic if we had the Golden Armada making their valiant last stand against the Dying of the Light, just for the mission to immediately end because a pack of Zerglings slipped by and killed off your last remaining pylons. So for this mission, the quote-unquote win condition is for all of your structures and units to perish. Which is important to distinguish, as this allows us to abuse the AI by letting them destroy our main base. And then the AI is going to scan the map for forces, particularly ground forces, which in this case is going to be Zeratul, who will make his final sacrifice for the Protoss right by this ridge. And after he dies, the ground waves actually just give up. Yeah, despite them being able to attack my Archons here, the AI recognizes that they cannot physically reach this location, so they don't consider attack moving here. So until you attack a different location or ground unit with your air forces, they'll just be stun-locked for the rest of eternity. Which is why we specifically planned Zeratul's death right here, as that allows us to reliably aggro the enemies into a location very far away from our main base, all the while staying in an optimal position for our Archons to shred any incoming air attacks. And if you're curious, yeah, this is the main reason why we don't want carriers joining our army, as our interceptors will regularly attempt to attack enemy ground units if they're even remotely close to their target. Which they will be. And that'll regularly aggro enemies towards our Achilles heel, which is less than ideal. Suboptimal, even. So with this strategy, all that we have to contend with are the incoming airwaves, in which you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, sure, cool Davey, you got rid of the ground attacks. And yeah, you also have access to this insane death ball which will wipe out most of the incoming air attacks, but ultimately you'll still be sustaining losses until you die. And yeah, you're entirely right. We sustain loss after loss, after loss, after loss, after loss. But then nothing happens. Nothing spawns anymore. In fact, nothing will spawn anymore unless we directly intervene. And the reason why is actually genius. There's too many enemies on the map. So to try and help prevent lag, new waves and new enemies will not spawn until enough units on screen are killed. But the units currently on screen are effectively stun-locked. They won't attack us. So eventually, after you hold off for long enough and you set everything up correctly, the Protoss just live. Forever. They won. But of course you may be thinking to yourself, yeah, alright, cool, but what if we want to keep killing the hybrid? I mean, can you really say that the Protoss won if their entire civilization is forced to remain within a few vessels for all eternity? What if we want to overthrow Amon and reclaim the universe to the Firstborn? And just like Legacy of the Void, Zeratul's sacrifice here allows us to do just that. Since all the enemies are rallying right here, we can actually attack them with no resistance as long as we're cloaked. Which is especially simple since Overseers seem to be the only unit that retreat if the attack wave they're assigned to is defeated. Probably due to the fact that they literally cannot deal damage, and since none of the attack waves on screen are, attacking anything, the Overseers just fly away to hang out outside of the map, which results in literal hundreds of them just vibing in the middle of nowhere out of bounds. Which is not only kind of funny, but also provides a very realistic win condition in which we kill every single unit on screen that isn't an Overseer and effectively supply block Amon on worthless units, which allows the Protoss to rebuild with absolutely no resistance. So with all this in mind, all we have to do is keep our Tannis far away from the ridge, but keep him close enough for our air units to stay within the Shield of Ire's cloaking field, and slowly kill off all of the ground units getting rallied here. Easy peasy. However, if you want to play it extra safe, as Overseers will accompany any incoming airways, which can realistically result in you losing precious Void Rays if you're not careful, Mohandar is an infinitely safer option to dispose of the Zerg threat. I said that you want to keep him alive earlier, and the reason why is extremely simple. Hydralisks have 6 range. Hybrid Destroyers have 7. Mohandar has 8. Yeah, so assuming you use all of his range, it's actually impossible for enemy ground units to attack him. Meanwhile, he can freely dish out as much punishment as he wants. GG easy. And also, to finally loop back to the mineral fields here, there's 3 reasons as to why they're so important to maintain. Firstly, sometimes the hybrid will vibrate so intensely due to the literal hundreds of units all attempting to attack move this one location that they can actually manage to land hits some Mohandar, even if he's attacking from a safe range. And secondly, even assuming you're fortunate enough to win the Wiggle War, since the AI recognizes that they shouldn't be able to attack Mohandar, even with Amon turning up to Cha-Cha Slide, whenever he locks onto a target, they'll attempt to flee from his wrath. Which isn't an issue when they're actively struggling against the mineral fields, but if they're all depleted, it's honestly really fucking frustrating. Not only is Mohandar much more vulnerable to enemy attacks, but confirming kills becomes wildly inconsistent. So not only is the risk and micro required substantially increased, but the amount of damage you can actually inflict is substantially decreased. It's just a bad time for everyone involved. But thirdly, if you run out of minerals at this base, you cannot get a Nidus Worm to emerge here, which does require some elaboration, as its implementation is very strange. So there are a few critical moments in which Nidus Worms emerge around, or even inside your base. But to ensure that the best strategy on this mission wasn't just keeping them alive and killing the endless hordes of cannon fodder flooding out of them, they exclusively spawn broodlings that do not count towards your mission objective. Except for this one, which spawns a fuck ton of Zerglings instead, which for some reason do count. But for the Nidus Worm to tunnel here, you have to have a base nearby, as well as workers harvesting minerals. And note that I'm specifying minerals and not just resources. If you're only harvesting Vespene gas, the AI just doesn't seem to care at all. Yeah, when combined with a few other reasons I'm going to get into shortly, I deeply suspect that this is a last-minute addition by Blizzard. But optimally, you want to have a few probes nearby harvesting the last remaining minerals so that you can force the Nidus Worm to spawn and then quickly abandon the base. This is a rather well-known cheese for beating the mission, as you can just have a few Dark Templars slashing an infinite horde of Zerglings for easy kills, but in this case it's still immensely valuable, as it's another obstacle that'll obfuscate the AI's pathing. In this case about 20 billion Zerglings, and surprisingly they don't actually count towards the entity cap. So if you really want to, with enough patience and micro, there is totally a world in which you hit the Overseer cap and just have a few Archons farming Zerglings forever. So overall, it's pretty nice. I will concede it isn't strictly mandatory. I actually forgot about the Nidus Worm entirely on some of my most successful runs, but assuming you're already going out of your way to leave the mineral fields up, it's yet another optimization you can make to assure that the Protoss have the best time possible. Now, of course, with all this said, I've kind of hinted at this already, but it does deserve to be said outright. If you decide to attack the Zerg, once enough enemies are slain, the AI will continue to send out more attack waves. But the reason I'm only just now mentioning this is because it actually isn't really a problem. Firstly, the Protoss have shields. Very, very durable shields. And if they're all fully recharged, the odds of the Zerg ever actually killing one of our units is extremely low. Plus, even if there was some risk involved, Artanis will likely have a decent energy pool available, so any possibility of us sustaining losses is more or less completely nullified by Vortex. And secondly, there's usually only going to be 1 to 3 attack waves sent out before the game pauses the assault again, which makes handling them completely trivial. So, yeah. With this setup, you are winner. And I'd wager knowing that the Protoss can easily handle the end times, even when the race is nearly extinct, and that by proxy, Kerrigan isn't instrumental for the survival of the universe. I'm not all too sure Jim, Valerian, or God forbid Zeratul would be all too valiant on capturing her alive, which means that Tychus wins the Super Bowl and the trilogy never happens. Starcraft 2 ends here, with me and the boys menacingly hovering over this dumb rock for all eternity. And I'm kind of alright with that. Anyways, now that we're stuck here for at least a few millennia with really nothing better to do, I think it's a good time to cherish those who have supported us during our darkest hours. And by us, I mean me, and by darkest hours, I mean 2024. Okay, actually that last part kinda still stands, but what I'm getting at here is that it's Patreon and YouTube member recognition time. So, although I have to personally thank all of you for watching this video, I have to give an extra parasocial thank you to Raymond Yin, Maggie Danger, Cassie42, Luke GB, Cork Attack, Safiarter 201, Hornet, Rory of the Abyss, Cone Without Name, Ram XE, Preseptic, Space Drake, Vasel V, Henry, Elliot R, Skrunkledunkle, Delta 7B, Bulldoggside, Monnery, Tom B, The Muppet Guy, Mikolai, Asphalt, Andrew F, Blue Sailor, Morphus, Inferno Kieran, Lungulus, Blasphemy Enthusiast, Frank, Hannah K, Anon1, Al Diaz, Wumpus, Teachy Boy, Darling Mim, Dan, Black Jade, Jacob S, Michael P, Breadman, Catapult Man 1, Judge and Jury, Teddy Bear Guy, MOS, Mr. Bones, Pyromusical, and Blazeheart. As always, if you're interested in the perks displayed on screen now, which to market myself a little bit, we've recently had a full Patreon and YouTube membership overhaul, so if that's something you may be interested in, relevant links are always included in the description below, alongside some other potentially neat or useful information. But I sincerely hope that you enjoyed the video. It's a shorter outro than usual today because I have to get back into the content mines due to this video's release being extremely delayed because I got hit with a cold about 95% of the way through the project, with about 4.5% of that rather comically being voiceover work. So I am suffering, but I'm sure I'll get through it. Hopefully. But as always, my friends,
oh, here I go! Whoa! Shit! Oh, he's good! Let's watch it! Oh, yeah! Oh, yes! That's the one! He's so fucking talented!